I want to belong to you tonight. The frail whisper broke the silence inside the log cabin, trembling under the storm. Miriam, a dark-skinned woman just pulled back from the edge of death, pressed her face to the chest of Elias Ward, pleading for warmth from the widower who had buried his heart a decade ago. Outside, snow sealed the door shut, but inside, her heated breath and the clutch of her hands against the man the town called a hermit stirred a fire he had sworn dead. Elias froze, stiff as stone, the vow made at his wife's grave colliding with the hunger rising in his blood. The fire crackled, shadows of their bodies spilling across the walls like a confession. He drew her tighter, his voice rough as he promised not to leave her. But would one night of fate be enough to break through 10 winters of solitude, or only open a trial harsher than the storm outside? The mountain wind howled in sharp gusts, slashing across the slope like 1,000 blades cutting into the snowbound earth. That storm was unlike any Elias Ward had ever known. The valley lay drowned in white, ancient pines shuddered to their roots, and stone ridges groaned as if they might split beneath the force. Elias pulled his worn wool cloak tighter across his shoulders, the axe wedged beneath his arm, his back bent low against the gale. He had meant only to gather a few more sticks of dry wood, enough to keep the cabin fire alive through the night. But the moment he stepped off the porch, the wind struck hard, nearly knocking him to his knees. Snow came deep, swallowing each step up to his calves, dragging at him as though he carried a block of ice on his back. In his mind, the old vow rose again, the words he had once whispered over his wife's grave a decade ago. I will not let my heart stir again. I will live the rest of my days for you and you alone. From that day forward, Elias chose the life of a hermit. He raised his cabin in the mountains, grew potatoes, kept horses, hunted deer. For 10 winters, no laughter had crossed his threshold, no glance lingered on the face of another woman. That night, with the storm howling like a chorus of devils, Elias thought he faced nothing more than another bout with the wilderness. He did not expect that stepping beyond the porch would open a new beginning. When he had split the first bundle of wood, he paused and lifted his head. Amid the fury of the wind, another sound wove through, faint, broken, yet unwilling to vanish. At first, he thought it only trickery of the storm, false echoes conjured by the mountains. But the sound came again, ragged, like a moan torn apart and flung back by the gale. Lowering the axe, Elias turned his ear. His heart jolted. Heavy boots sank deep as he pushed toward the slope where the wind drove hardest. Just a few steps farther, and his eyes caught a darker shape against the white expanse. A body. The figure lay face down, nearly buried in snow, limbs curled tight, unmoving. Elias froze, his pulse hammering, and then memory struck. 10 years gone. The night he had clutched his wife's lifeless form while the wind screamed, his voice lost in the storm. His whole body stiffened, but his legs carried him forward all the same. He dropped to his knees, sweeping snow away with his hands. The lantern he carried shook wildly, its thin light spilling across the face of a young woman. Her skin was deep brown, her lips blue, her breath so faint it seemed already gone. Her thin dress was soaked and frozen to her frame. Fingers clawed at the snow, as though she had fought fate until the very end. Merciful God, Elias rasped, his hands trembling. Whether from cold or dread, he could not tell. Sliding an arm beneath her, he lifted her slight weight. She was terrifyingly light, as though emptied of all strength. The chill of her body pierced through his cloak, into his very flesh. He held her close, his broad shoulders shielding her from the storm, and braced himself against the gale toward the cabin. Each step was war. Wind slashed, snow stung his face raw. The lantern snuffed out somewhere behind him, leaving only the dim smear of a sky devoured by storm. In his arms, her body hung limp, breath shallow. The cabin door loomed, groaning beneath the wind's assault. Elias rammed his shoulder against it, the wood shuddering before it burst open. The storm hurled itself inside like a blade of ice. He kicked the door shut, then lowered her gently by the hearth. Inside, the fire had dwindled to embers. He piled on dry logs, blew hard until the flames leapt up, painting her face in trembling red light. Hollow cheeks, lashes fluttering faintly, lips parted as if to speak. He sank to his knees, his wide hand pressing against her brow. Her skin was ice, his chest clenched. In that moment, the vow of 10 years felt brittle as frost. He was no longer the man who had buried his heart beneath his wife's stone. He was only a man, fighting to hold on to a fragile breath before it slipped away into the storm. The fire in the hearth had just flared, casting a red glow through the cabin, yet the woman's body still shook, each breath shallow and broken. Elias tore off his heavy cloak, but the fabric beneath clung wet and frozen to her skin. Her hair lay in tangled strands plastered to her hollow cheeks, lips blue, trembling. He drew in a breath, rough and uneven, his hands stiff as timber as they brushed the icy folds of her dress. His voice came hoarse as though he spoke to the world and to himself alike. "Forgive me. If these clothes stay, she will die." He did not wait for her answer. She was unconscious, drifting in the haze of fever and cold, eyes shut tight, lips murmuring fragments of nothing. His jaw locked, teeth grinding, hands trembling as he peeled away the frozen cloth. Each layer came free with a chill so sharp it stabbed into his own palms, making him shiver as though he too turned to stone. Clumsy, halting, he worked. Buttons stiff with ice split his fingertips until blood welled. Every motion felt like a whispered prayer, pleading with God to forgive him. A widower of 10 years now forced to touch the frail body of a stranger. At last, when the sodden dress was gone, Elias quickly wrapped her in 2 thick wool blankets. But even then he knew it would not be enough. Only one way remained to fight death, the warmth of flesh against flesh. Hands unsteady, he parted the blankets, lowered himself down, and drew her into his arms. He shook with a trembling he had not felt in years, chest pressed to her back, breath spilling hot against her chilled skin. "I will shut my eyes. I will not look," he muttered, a foolish promise spoken to no one but himself. But when her body met his, when her frailty leaned into his chest, his heart pounded against his ribs with violent urgency. 10 years of solitude, 10 years of burying his feelings under frost, torn apart by a single fragile breath, a body frozen and fragile in his arms. He pulled the blankets tight around them, clutching her close as though one loosened grip might let life slip away. Sweat, ice, and wood smoke clung together, filling the small cabin with the scent of survival. Each time he pressed his cheek against her damp hair, his chest ached with pity and fear. "Do not let your heart waver, Elias," he told himself, but the vow of old already felt far away, thin as mist. He held tighter, voice breaking to a whisper. "Hold on. Don't give up. You are not allowed to leave yet." Through that long night, Elias never let her go. The fire cracked, wind screamed against the walls, snow sealed the door, and for the first time in 10 years, two breaths mingled in the cabin that had known only one. Elias understood then the moment had carved an irreparable fracture into the vow he had sworn at his wife's grave. The night after she was pulled from the storm, Miriam Cole's breathing grew heavier. Her skin flushed unnaturally red, burning as if with hidden fire. The small log cabin filled with the sharp tang of sweat, mixed with the bitter steam of dried herbs Elias had dropped into boiling water. Her breaths came jagged, broken, then slipped away into silence, each pause clenching his heart tighter. He set the basin by the bed, wrung out a cloth, and pressed it to her brow. The water steamed off in moments, leaving heat that scorched his hand. He changed it again and again, his rough hands, so steady with axe and rope, suddenly awkward, trembling. Eyes gray from years of staring into indifferent snow now fixed upon the young woman's face, afraid that if he looked away, her breath might vanish. He sat there through the long hours. His back ached, his eyes burned dry, yet Elias did not move. His hand kept to its work, changing cloths, brushing wet strands from her brow, listening to the faintest sounds that cracked from her parched lips. Then, in the haze of fever, words broke free, fragile as a whisper torn by wind. "Don't force me. I don't want to share a roof." Elias went still. In that instant, the storm outside, the fever within, seemed nothing compared to the ache that gripped him. He did not understand it all, but enough to know. Her torment was not only from the cold. Behind those broken words lay memory, binding, a prison that had scarred her spirit. His hand stopped mid-air, the wet cloth dripping onto the quilt. Firelight flickered across his rigid face, his eyes deepening with something unfamiliar. Pity mingled with fury. Fury that someone had driven a woman so young to cry out in despair even in unconsciousness. Fury that he, who had sworn never to let another soul breach his heart, now found himself helpless before a fragile body carrying wounds he could not mend. He bent closer, muttered low, "No one will force you again, not under this roof." But Miriam did not hear. She trembled still, lips moving as if speaking to some shadow only she could see. Time dragged. The fire flared bright, then faltered low, but Elias never looked away from her wan face. He remembered his wife's last day, the flush of fever on her cheeks, the warmth draining until her eyes closed forever. The memory pressed at him like a scream, but he swallowed it down, gripping his own hand to stay steady. The night stretched endless. Elias did not sleep. He changed cloths, stoked the fire, pressed his calloused fingers to her thin wrist, clinging to the faint beat. In the red glow, he traced the lines of her face, the hollow cheeks, lashes that trembled, cracked lips that moved without rest. By dawn, snow still smothered the mountains outside. Inside, Elias replaced the final cloth. Her skin still burned, but her breathing had steadied, drawn longer, more even. He sank back in his chair, lids heavy, shoulders slack with exhaustion in the fading firelight. The hardness of his features softened for the first time in years. He knew the fight was far from over. The fever could return at any hour. Yet deep in his chest, Elias also knew this. He had crossed a line he once swore never to breach. The vow that his heart would never stir again, was no longer as unbreakable as mountain ice. A fracture had opened, and it began with the fragile breath of Miriam Cole. In the days that followed, Miriam's fever eased, leaving her pale but with eyes clear once more. The small log cabin, long accustomed to its heavy silence, began to fill with unfamiliar sounds, the soft tread of light feet across the floorboards, the clatter of dry wood as she fed the fire, the splash of water poured into the blackened iron pot. At first, Elias kept his distance. He rose before dawn, splitting wood on the porch, mending boards the storm had torn loose, and spoke little when he returned. He left kindling by the hearth, then sat at the table with his carving knife in hand. Miriam kept quiet, watching him like one might watch a gray mountain, sheltering, yet unreachable. She grew accustomed to finding her way in the cramped space. By daylight, seeping through the cracks, she practiced walking, fingers brushing familiar shapes. The pot hung on its iron hook, the worn wooden chair, the smoke-scented blanket. Weak still, she refused idleness. She swept the floor, cleared ash from the hearth, stacked the woodpile neat. Her hands, raw from the icy water, scrubbed tin dishes without complaint. Elias saw, but said nothing. Only once or twice, when he caught her swaying near the basin, his eyes flickered. Instead of stopping her, his voice came clipped and dry. Rest. Miriam lifted her dark eyes to his, then answered softly, I will not sit and wait for pity. His mouth pressed tight. He turned away, leaving silence heavy in his wake. Evenings brought a muted glow. Elias set a pot of thin soup on the table, ladled 2 bowls, slid one toward her without meeting her gaze. Miriam lifted her spoon, the scent of salted meat and dried potatoes stinging her eyes. Not for the flavor, but for the simple fact that after days of flight, she now sat before a meal with warmth, across from another soul. Thank you, she murmured. Elias gave only a curt nod, eyes on his bowl. Yet for a moment, his gaze lingered on her trembling hand before turning aside. Days settled into rhythm. Miriam learned to stir the fire before dawn, to dry damp clothes by the flames, to listen for the wind's whistle against the walls and add wood before it waned. Elias remained quiet, speaking only when needed. Stack the wood there. Don't go out in the wind. Eat. The rest he left to silence. But in that silence, small gestures wove a fragile thread. While he carved, she placed another log on the fire, its light spilling across his broad shoulders. When she dozed in her chair, he drew a blanket over her and retreated as if he'd never touched her. These unspoken acts, multiplied day by day, stretched into a bond finer yet stronger than the storm's snow. One evening, Elias returned from the barn to find cornbread on the low table. Its crust was charred, its scent faintly bitter, yet the cabin, long steeped in broth, brimmed with a new fragrance. Miriam stood by the stove, hands dusted white, eyes waiting. Elias broke off a piece, chewed, slowly, then gave a small nod. No word of praise, but enough to set her face aglow as if she'd been given a gift. When she slept, Elias often sat long by her bed. He adjusted the blanket higher, wedged the door against the draft, fed the fire so it would burn through the night. Firelight spilled across her fragile face, and each time he looked, his chest tightened with a weight of sorrow and anger. Sorrow for what had marked her, anger at the shadowed past she carried, hidden from him. Miriam sensed it. Though he averted his eyes, she saw it in every clumsy kindness, every nod, every silence heavy with care. She began to answer in her own quiet ways, patching the frayed curtain, stacking wood where he would not stumble, latching the door against the gale. Some nights the cabin glowed red with fire while Elias carved wolves into wood, their muzzles lifted to howl at nothing. Miriam sat nearby, mending a torn sleeve. No words passed, yet presence itself was enough. Once, as he fed the flames, she spoke softly. "You need not fear my eyes." His hand tightened around the log until his knuckles whitened. He tossed it into the blaze, sparks leaping, and said nothing. Miriam did not press. She only smiled faintly, telling herself one day he might let her see the wound he kept hidden. Those first days brought few words, but many unspoken ties. Each night, as the wind shrieked and snow pressed heavy on the cabin walls, the silence between them stitched itself into something neither dared to name. A thread fine and fragile, yet both clung to it as to the last warmth left in a winter without mercy. That morning, the sky opened in a heavy slate gray. Snow had ceased, yet the trail down to the valley lay buried thick, slick, and bitter cold. Elias hitched the horse to the sled, tossing in a few empty hides to carry salt, coffee, and flour. Miriam wrapped herself in his heavy coat, scarf drawn over her head. Her face was pale, but her eyes held steady resolve. They left the cabin while mist still hung low. Elias sat in front, his broad hands gripping the reins, shoulders squared like a wall against the wind. Miriam sat behind, her arms circling his back for balance. Silence held them, broken only by the horse's breath and the wind whipping along the ridges. By mid-morning, Cedar Ridge appeared, a narrow street lined with saloon, general store, blacksmith, and a wooden church. The air smelled of roasting coffee and damp smoke. But when Elias's sled creaked into town, heads turned at once. Whispers slid like wind through a canyon. There, Holt, the hermit after 10 years. And the colored woman with him. Look at that. Eyes burned from every doorway, porch, and church step. Some lifted brows, some sneered. Mothers pulled children aside. Miriam felt each stare pierce her skin like sharpened blades. Elias stepped down, face set. He strode into the general store, voice rough and clipped. Salt, coffee, a bit of flour. Keller, the storekeeper, faltered for a breath, but forced a polite smile, wrapped the goods without pause. Miriam stood behind, chin held high though her hands trembled in the sleeves. When they stepped out, murmurs clung like burrs. A man like him, bringing a woman up the mountain. And that woman's not clean. Elias heard every word. His fist tightened on the sack strap, veins rising hard, but he gave no reply. He loaded the sled in silence. Miriam, seated behind him, felt shame burn hot beneath her skin, yet also felt shielded by his quiet defiance. The road home stretched long, white light reflecting from every drift, blinding. Neither spoke. Elias held the reins tight, jaw hard. Miriam wrapped her arms around herself, fighting off the sting of the town's cruelty. Then it happened. From the folds of her coat slipped an old envelope, edges creased, tumbling into the snow. Elias halted, bent and picked it up. His eyes caught the bold print across its face. Marriage contract. Malcolm Ashford. Darkness clouded his gaze. He unfolded it, the words clear even in the dim light, lines of careful script, sealed with a red stamp. And there, Written plain, he read the cruelty. The bride will reside with the gentleman and his mistress. His blood froze. It was more than a forced marriage. It was degradation, a chain that treated a woman as trade, a body to be divided and discarded. Elias lifted his head. Miriam sat rigid, lips trembling, eyes wide in dread. She moved as if to snatch it back, but Elias had already folded the paper. His hand shook, yet his voice came low and steady. Yours. He held it out to her, nothing more. Miriam clutched it, knuckles whitening. She longed to speak, to tell him it was never her choice, that she had fled to salvage what dignity remained. But his face, lined deep with hardship and shadowed darker still, his eyes like winter ice, strangled her words before they rose. The horse drew them onward, hooves striking steady, yet the space between them widened into a gulf. In Elias's mind, the whispers of Cedar Ridge tangled with the words from that letter, and behind them rose the face of his wife, the woman he had sworn never to betray. Now Miriam's presence, bound to that paper, pressed like a knife into the wound he had carried all these years. Miriam bowed her head, clutching the envelope tight. Silent tears slipped down, soaking into his coat draped around her shoulders. She knew from that moment a wall had risen between them. No storm-built drift, but a truth laid bare, sharp and merciless. That night, the cabin glowed with fire, yet silence lay heavier than ever. Elias sat at the table, carving until his fingertips bled, unaware. Miriam kept to the hearth, her eyes lost in the flames. Both heard the storm's wail outside, but louder still within was the sound of a fragile thread snapping, the bond they had only begun to weave. From then on, the cabin held more than snow and wind. It carried a secret made plain, a twisted betrothal, a past that hunted close, and a distance thickening between two souls who had almost touched warmth. That night, the wind howled long and low, like wolves lost in the valley. Snow fell so thick it nearly sealed the cabin door, leaving only a narrow crack for the gale to shriek through. Elias wedged planks tight against it, then sat, shoulders burdened in shadow. Miriam had stoked the fire early. Its orange light leapt across rough-hewn walls, warming the room but exposing the distance between them. On the low table rested an old bottle of corn whiskey. Elias had not meant to drink. He had avoided the burn of liquor for years, knowing too well how it loosened the chains he kept on memory. But tonight, silence pressed too heavy, and Miriam's gaze cut too deep. He reached, pulled the cork. The pop echoed sharp in the stillness. He poured into a tin cup, the dark liquid shimmering in the firelight. Across from him, Miriam's hand trembled as she lifted her own cup, but her eyes stayed firm. She drank a small sip, the whiskey searing her throat, burning through her chest, blooming heat in her belly until her cheeks flushed. Elias drank deeper, each swallow as if to scorch away the distance that remained. For a while, only the crack of wood and the whistle of wind filled the cabin. Then Miriam set down her cup and looked straight at him. Her voice was soft, yet steady. You keep me at arm's length because of my stained past, don't you? The words dropped like a stone into frozen water. Elias's fist tightened on the cup, veins swelling in his hand. He wanted to turn away, to bury himself in silence as always. But the liquor had loosened the knots. He lifted his gaze, gray eyes dull as cold ash, voice rasping. No, I fear myself. He drained the cup, slammed it down, then slowly forced words he never thought he would speak. When I look at you, I can't control myself. The air went still, fire roared, yet could not bridge the space between them. Miriam's heart thundered, lips parting, but no words came. Elias bowed his head, hand covering half his face. 10 years I buried it all with my wife's grave. I swore my heart would never stir again. And yet, since you came, the distance is gone. I feel I betray her memory. Miriam reached across, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. His skin burned, trembling as if fevered. He startled, eyes lifting. In hers there was no judgment, only a sad, clear understanding. Elias, she whispered, you've done no wrong. Memory does not die, but the living, they deserve to keep on living. He stared at her, the fire reflected deep in her dark eyes. Breath quickened, lips nearly touching. His chest pounded, each beat straining like it would break through bone. He leaned closer, and Miriam did not pull away. In that suspended moment, the world outside ceased. There was only the fire's glow, the sharp scent of whiskey, the press of two hearts near to breaking. Their lips neared, a kiss that might burn away vows and walls alike. Then Elias flinched. The image of his wife rose in his mind, her gentle face beneath snow and stone. He jerked back, breath ragged as if plunging into icy water. No, he gasped. He turned from her, rose, braced a hand against the wall by the hearth. His shoulders heaved, heavy with both hunger and torment. Miriam sat still. Tears welled, but she swallowed them down. She knew he remained bound to his past, a loyalty noble yet merciless. Elias stood long in silence, broad back quivering in the firelight. His voice came low, as if speaking only to himself. I cannot betray her, yet I cannot deny. I have felt. Neither slept. Miriam lay turned to the wall, biting her lip until it bled. Elias remained at the table, the bottle emptying, unfinished wolf carvings piling beside him. The fire dwindled to coals, glowing red like his heart, burning but on the edge of ash. Outside, the wind moaned and snow buried the door. Inside, two souls trembled, not from the storm, but from the desire neither dared to name. That morning, the sky hung low and heavy. Gray clouds spread thick across the peaks like a woolen shroud. Elias stepped onto the porch, axe still in hand, meaning to split a few more logs before snow began again. Then he stopped short. From far off came the pounding of hooves. 3 horses, not one. The sound rang sharp and urgent, echoing along the slopes, nothing like the steady plod of his own stock. He set the axe down, turned, and took the rifle from its peg beside the door. Inside, Miriam bent over the hearth, lifted her head at the noise. Her face drained of color when she caught sight of figures riding hard down the mountainside. At their head rode Malcolm Ashford, astride a great white stallion. The brim of his hat cast shadow across eyes cold as steel, while a crooked smile cut across his face. In his gloved hand, he held high a packet of papers, the red seal glaring bright as blood against the snow. On either side flanked 2 gunmen unknown to Elias, their hands already twitching near their holsters, grins mocking. The horses clattered to a halt in the yard, snow spraying from hooves. Malcolm stayed in the saddle, voice booming so all the timbered slopes could hear. Miriam Cole, you belong to me. Here it is in ink and seal, marriage contract signed and witnessed. Holt, You're harboring another man's lawful bride." His words cracked the air, arrogant and brazen. Inside, Miriam shook. Her skin blanched, her hands twisted into her skirt until her knuckles split. Memories surged back. His possessive eyes, the venom in his tone, the nights she had trembled under his shadow. She shrank into the corner, unable to step forward. The rumor carried quick as wildfire. Neighbors, long watchful of Elias's solitude, gathered among the pines, peering down into his yard. Whispers cut the cold. So she had a betrothed all along, and still lives with Holt, no better than a ruined woman. Each word struck Miriam like a lash. She knew if she stepped out, the town would see her as a deceiver. The past she had tried to bury had risen to tear the roof away. Elias stepped onto the porch. Rifle firm in his grip, his eyes shone hard as forged iron. He stood broad and unyielding, blocking the doorway. He did not glance back at Miriam's ragged breath behind him. "Get off my land, Malcolm," Elias growled. "One more step, and I fire." Malcolm laughed loud, his mirth rolling across the frosted valley. He shook the paper aloft, his voice dripping scorn. "You think to spit on the law, Holt? This is binding and sealed. The whole town will side with me. And you? Just a widower hiding in the hills. No one believes your word." The crowd's murmurs swelled, eyes cutting toward Elias, others fixed on Miriam with disdain. She fought to hold back tears, but her trembling shoulders betrayed her fear. Elias narrowed his eyes, lifting the rifle higher. His words struck sharp, deliberate. "This is my mountain, my law, and I say, if you linger here, the next sound you hear will be led through your chest." The air tightened to a breaking point. Malcolm's gun hands slid nearer to their weapons, eyes flashing with violence. Yet Elias did not flinch, his finger brushing the trigger, gaze unyielding as stone. That icy calm stilled even the hired killers, who hesitated where lesser men would fire. Malcolm's smirk faltered. He knew Holt's reputation. 10 winters alone on the mountain had forged a man who would not bluff when it came to survival. At last, Malcolm sneered, lowering the papers. "Very well. I won't waste bullets today. But hear me, Holt. No contract dies because you will it so. She will come back to me sooner or later, and when that day comes, I won't ride alone." He jerked the reins. His stallion reared, screaming into the cold air. Then he wheeled away. His men followed, casting venomous looks over their shoulders. The sound of hooves faded, leaving only the mournful wind and the uneasy murmurs of onlookers. Slowly, they too slipped back into the trees, none daring to meet Elias's storm-gray eyes. Lowering the rifle, Elias stepped back inside. Miriam still clung to the wall, lips bloodless, hands clenched until they bled. When the door slammed shut, she lifted her gaze to him, eyes a tangle of gratitude and dread. "You shouldn't defy him," she whispered, voice breaking. "He will return. He won't let this go." Elias studied her, face carved with lines deep as canyon stone. His reply came low, steady as the earth. "I know. But you are no longer alone. If he comes back, I'll be here." Miriam bit her lip, and the tears finally spilled. She understood now. The mountain was no longer a hiding place. The past had climbed to their very door, bringing danger and the poisoned tongues of neighbors. But she also knew this: she would not face it alone again. A man had stood before her cabin, rifle raised, shielding her against both the town and the power of Malcolm Ashford. Outside, the riders vanished beyond the pines, but Malcolm's promise lingered in the wind. I will return. Inside, the fire cast its glow across Elias and Miriam, two figures bound in silence, knowing winter had only just begun, and that their days of peace were already numbered. That night, the mountain wind screamed long and sharp, cold as 1,000 blades cutting through the cabin's narrow seams. The log walls shuddered beneath the storm. Firelight flickered, its glow breaking against rough timber, fragile warmth in a sea of frost. Miriam lay curled on the bed, her body shaking, sweat soaking the pillow, breath ragged and uneven. Elias sat close, calloused hand wringing a damp cloth, laying it against her brow. Within moments it burned hot, and he replaced it again. The motion repeated, clumsy yet steady, patience wrapped around every movement. He had seen fevers before in these winters, but never had his heart clenched so tightly. Each drop of sweat rolling down her temple seemed to soak straight into his chest, weighing his breath. Miriam stirred, lips cracked, voice trembling, faint as if carried off on the wind. Help me. Keep warm. The words struck him like a blade, tearing through the walls he had built. He knew if her body sank further into cold, she would not last till dawn. Instinct pulled him forward, but inside raged a battle. His broad hands trembled as he bent, drew her slight frame against his chest, and wrapped her close. The chill of her skin made him shudder, as though he held a block of ice slowly breaking apart. He pulled the thickest blanket over them both, pressing her to him, passing heat through flesh and heartbeat. His voice rasped in her ear, trembling. Forgive me. I will not let you die in this cold. Miriam buried her face into his chest, seeking shelter. Her breath came hot and quick against his skin, igniting a fire deep within. His heart hammered so loudly she could hear it, a reminder that life was still near, bound to her. Then, through the fever, she whispered, words broken but clear. Please, don't turn from me anymore. I want to belong to you, tonight. Her fingers slid up his chest, weak yet insistent, leaving a trail of heat even through the coarse fabric. Her cheeks glowed crimson, part fever, part daring confession. Her breath burned against his skin, intoxicating, unsteady, and it drowned him. In that moment, the world seemed to collapse. 10 years he had lived as if already dead, swearing his heart would never stir again. Yet here, in her arms, with her trembling plea, the vow felt like chains strangling his very breath. He closed his eyes tight, hand gripping the blanket till his knuckles blanched. His body trembled, not from cold but from the fire tearing through him. A flame he had buried in solitude surged back, fierce as the storm outside. He bent, pressing a fleeting kiss to her fevered brow, his lips quaking. Thank you for giving me that gift, he murmured, voice thick, broken. But not yet. Not tonight. Heal first. Miriam gave a small sound, eyes blurred with tears, gaze both desperate and yielding. She did not fight him. She only pressed closer, clinging to the beat of his heart, as if it alone kept her anchored. Elias held her tighter, feeling her breaths slowly steady, her shivers ease. Yet inside, the fire would not die. It burned, clawing, threatening to raze the walls he had raised for a decade. He knew this was the second time he had nearly lost himself, the first with whiskey and a kiss undone, and now in the fevered tremor of Miriam's arms. Outside, snow thickened, erasing all tracks on the porch. The wind howled through the pines, echoing the storm inside him. But in the cabin, two breaths mingled, sweat, smoke, and longing coiling into a heady haze. At the edge of sleep, Miriam whispered once more, voice fractured, pleading, "Don't leave me alone." Elias bowed his head, lips brushing her damp hair. "I won't." That night, he sat unmoving, cradling her in his arms, not only guarding her fragile life, but also the blaze raging in his own chest. A fire more dangerous than the storm beating at the cabin walls. A few days later, once Miriam's fever had broken, Elias made ready to ride down for medicine and supplies. He meant to go alone, but Miriam stood firm. Her eyes, still ringed with weariness, shone with a determination he could not quell. He knew he could not keep her locked away in the cabin forever. That morning the sky sagged low and gray, ice patches scattered along the trail. As Elias's sled creaked into Cedar Ridge, the air shifted. Work stopped. Heads turned. Whispers stirred like dry leaves. Word of Malcolm Ashford's visit to the cabin had already seeped through the valley. Elias gripped Miriam's hand as they stepped down. Her fingers shook, but her hold was strong. Her dark eyes, steady and unflinching, carried something resolute. As he had expected, Malcolm was waiting. He stood in the center of the square, flanked by the same two gunmen. His smile spread wide with triumph the moment he saw her. In his hand he held high the contract, the red seal flashing like blood against the dim sky. "There," he bellowed, his voice booming over the cold air. "You all see it. She is my betrothed. Holt stole her, kept her hidden up in his cabin. I have the right, the ink and the seal to prove it." The crowd rose in noise, whispers hardening into barbs. Living with Holt all this time. Shameless. Nothing but a ruined woman. Miriam froze, her hand clammy in Elias's grip. But then she drew a breath, stepped forward, and pulled from her cloak a small, worn notebook, leather frayed, pages stained with ink. Breaking from Elias's shadow, she stood tall. Her voice trembled but rang clear. "Yes, there was a contract, but it was never to protect me. It was to sell me." The square fell still. Malcolm faltered for a moment, then sneered. Empty words. Who would believe a runaway woman? Miriam lifted the journal high, flipping to its marked pages. Her voice grew stronger, each word carving the air. "This is my record." Every line of that twisted contract. It said, "The bride will live with the gentleman and his mistress." The seal is there. The words are there. This was no marriage. This was degradation. She held aloft the paper itself, unfolding it for all to see. Her voice cracked, but carried. "The bride is to be treated as property. The bride must obey both the gentleman and any he names. The bride has no right to refuse." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The women, who had been quickest to scorn her, now muttered, their faces darkening with outrage. Their whispers turned sharp, then loud. One man's voice rang above the rest. "That's no marriage. That's an insult to humanity." Malcolm's mask slipped. He roared back, desperation cracking his tone. "Silence! The word of a colored woman means nothing. You'll believe her over me?" But Miriam did not falter. Her eyes blazed, her hands tight on the journal. Better to die on the mountain than live as your plaything. The cry rang across the square, echoing off the clapboard walls, carrying to the farthest ears. A tide rose. Voices broke into shouts, angry and defiant. "Get out, Malcolm! Enough shame! We won't stomach this!" Elias stood just behind her, rifle slung but unread. His stare alone was steel enough to force Malcolm's hired guns a step back. Malcolm tried to sneer, but the twitch of his mouth betrayed him. His eyes flicked over the crowd, no longer cowed, no longer whispering. Their judgment now fell squarely on him. Snarling, he crushed the contract in his fist, flung it into the mud, and yanked his reins. The stallion reared, hooves striking sparks on frozen ground. "You'll see me again," he spat, "and when I return, you'll pay dearly." He wheeled away, his riders thundering after. Snow sprayed in their wake. The crowd jeered, some hurling snowballs as he vanished. At the square's heart, Miriam stood trembling, clutching her journal, her face streaked with sweat and tears, her eyes shining like fire. Elias stepped forward, took her hand, steadied her against his chest. For the first time in years, the town's eyes on him were not suspicious, but respectful, quiet. Inside Miriam, the wall of fear cracked. She had spoken, she had stood, and she had not fallen. Her past was no longer a chain bowed over her. The whole town had seen, and the balance had shifted for good. That night, after all the storms that had swept over them like avalanches of snow, Elias's cabin glowed with a quieter fire. Outside, the wind still howled down the ridges. But within those timber walls, the air had changed. No longer the heavy silence of fear and mistrust, but the hush that follows a battle, where two worn spirits had found one another at last. Miriam sat by the hearth, an old shawl drawn over her shoulders, eyes fixed on the sparks rising from the flames. Her hair spilled loose, damp from melted snow, yet the orange glow warmed her face with a softness Elias had not seen before. He stepped in from the cold, shoulders still bearing the strain of that morning's confrontation. For a time he said nothing, only lowered himself opposite her, the fire throwing its light across the lines of his weathered face. In the gray of his eyes flickered something new, fragile and bright. He drew in a deep breath, gathering courage, his voice low and rough. "The words you spoke, do they still stand?" Miriam lifted her gaze. Color rose in her cheeks even before she understood. But his look, earnest, uncertain, left her no place to turn. Her dark eyes shimmered, lips trembling, and after a pause she nodded, shy but resolute. Elias felt his chest tighten, as if bound by iron. 10 years he had locked his heart, sworn it would never quicken again. Now a single nod shattered that vow. He sat there awkward, fumbling like a young man before his first kiss. Slowly, his rough hand reached across the space and brushed hers. Her small hand, cold and trembling, did not pull away. She let him close his fingers around it, as though she had been waiting for that touch all along. Elias swallowed hard, breath heavy, half ashamed for asking, wholly grateful for her answer. The space between them, built from fear and invisible walls, collapsed in silence. Their breaths mingled, warm in the glow of the fire. Elias leaned down, lips meeting hers, hesitant, unpracticed. The kiss of a man who had forgotten the shape of tenderness. Miriam's heart raced as she closed her eyes, arms rising to circle his shoulders, drawing him nearer. The kiss deepened, hungry as a spark caught by wind. Elias trembled, his hands, trained for axe and rifle, fumbling against the softness of her skin. He traced the line of her back, down to her waist, lips trailing from her mouth to the hollow of her neck. Her skin tasted of wood smoke and salt, fragile yet alive. Miriam gave a low sound, breath quick and uneven, her fingers gripping the coarse fabric of his shirt. To her, Elias was no longer the silent hermit of the mountain, but a man, flesh, blood, and longing, quaking under desire. Every kiss, every touch he gave was not hurried, not claiming, but careful. He moved slow, as though each moment must be carved into memory, as though she were something precious that might break. Miriam, in turn, opened herself, not hiding, but yielding, letting him see the parts of her she had always kept veiled. Firelight cast their joined shadows on the wall, two forms pressed close, trembling, yearning, yet cradled in gentleness. The cabin, once only shelter against storm, now filled with gasps, whispers, the fragile chorus of two hearts breaking open. In Elias's arms, Miriam felt herself seen as a woman, no longer a contract's pawn, no longer a runaway, but herself, desired, cherished. And for Elias, each breath from her lips ripped through the shroud of his long solitude. He no longer felt he betrayed the memory of the dead. Instead, he felt life stirring again, chosen freely, accepted with gratitude. They no longer heard the storm battering the cabin. There was only the warmth of skin, the rhythm of two hearts, the soft cadence of breath mingling with the crack of burning wood. Elias held her tight, his whisper sinking into her tangled hair. "Thank you for not leaving." Miriam answered by pressing a kiss to his chest, where his heart thundered. "I am here. And I will stay the night stretched long, carried on embraces that lingered, touches that spoke more than words." They discovered each other slowly, yet fully, letting each glance, each caress serve as proof of rebirth. At last, when weariness drew them into sleep, Elias still held Miriam against him, his face buried in her curls. For the first time in a decade, he did not hear the wind keening beyond the walls, nor feel the dark press in. He felt only the warmth of another soul, the hearth of a true home, kindled at last. Winter at last drew back from the Wyoming high country, leaving rills singing down the slopes, tender grass pushing through thawed crust, and birds busy as if no hard season had ever passed. Snow still clung to the stone faces, but the air had changed, softer, brighter, carrying the smell of wet earth and the promise of planting. Elias's cabin changed too. It was no longer a place of sighs and dying embers, but a home for two, where a shy laugh rose when Miriam fumbled with the woodpile, where the faint scorch of cornbread mingled with the kitchen smoke, where Elias's familiar boots marked his return from the barn. Every corner once dusted with solitude now bore signs of life. Out front, Elias drove new stakes and raised rows for corn. Miriam knelt beside him. Her hands, more used to needle and thread, turned dark with soil, but her eyes were bright. Elias watched her and felt something new in his chest. The quiet joy of a companion. Not a burden, not a duty. A pair, working side by side. At night, while the fire breathed steady, Miriam set a worn Bible on the table and read in a low voice. Elias carved as always, but now and then he looked up, and the light in her eyes warmed him more than the flames. Sometimes they said nothing, and the silence was no longer cutting. It was the stillness of two people who had found a shared rhythm. News from town shifted with time. At first, folks only whispered and watched. But after the day Miriam stood in the square, journal raised, cursed contract bared, their looks changed. No longer only scorn for a runaway black woman, no longer a suspicion for a mountain hermit. People began to say different things. That Miriam was brave, that Holt could do more than shoot. He could stand for what's right. On trips to Cedar Ridge, Elias no longer felt the full weight of cold shoulders. Someone tipped a nod. Someone tucked an extra sack of flour in his hands. Miriam was invited to church, careful at first, but invited all the same. One spring afternoon, as Elias led the horse in, he found Miriam at the fence, palm resting lightly against her belly. She said nothing, only leaned her head on his shoulder when he reached her. In the soft breath of the thawing wind, she whispered, "I never had a home." "Now I do." Elias closed his hand over hers. His heart rose with a feeling he had no easy name for. The vow of 10 years, "I will never let my heart stir again," was gone. In its place stood a new oath, carved in quiet. He would not leave her alone. He would not abandon her to storm or slander. Days fell into work that built a roof in more than one sense. Miriam sowed wild mustard by the window. Elias mended the stable roof. Together they gathered wood and sealed the cracks in the walls. At night they sat close, firelight soft on faces no longer grim. Miriam smiled more. Elias did too. Summer came. The corn stood taller each week. Birds returned to the eaves and filled the yard with song. In town, folks stopped talking about that old contract and turned to other talk. Holt had a real home now. Miriam had gone from stranger to part of the place. Someone asked Elias to fix a bridle. Someone asked Miriam to show a daughter how to stitch a hem. One morning, when the first thin snow of the new season dusted the yard, Elias stood on the porch, cloak on his shoulders, eyes on the easy horses. Miriam came out, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and slid her hand into his. They said nothing, only stood there, breath white in the air, mingling. In that quiet, Elias knew he had found his true home, not in planks that held against the gale, but in the hand he held, and the depth of the eyes turned up to him. Miriam smiled. It was a hearthfire kind of smile, one that keeps a long winter warm. Snow fell and covered the tracks, but they did not move. They stood together, no longer two strays, a family at last. That autumn, cold from the high peaks began to pour into the valley. Yet the cabin was warmer than it had ever been. By the hearth, Miriam stitched a tiny linen shirt the shopkeeper's wife had given. Each careful pass of the needle seemed to lace hope into the cloth. Elias at the door hung his hunting rifle back on its peg and watched her with a hushed kind of wonder. He had not expected any of this, that in his 40s, 10 years after a life that seemed finished with him, he would have a roof, a wife, and now a small life on the way. The feeling was strange and tight in his chest. He had never dared to dream it. Yet here it was, inside his own walls. Winter came. Miriam bore a daughter. The night was white with heavy snow and fierce wind, but in the cabin a new cry rose in the arms of a trembling father. Elias took the child from the midwife, his rough hands cupping a warm, pink, fragile weight. His eyes stung, his throat closed. "Our girl," Miriam whispered, spent but shining. Elias bent and looked at the soft eyelids, the little mouth working. Words failed him. Something else rose up instead, as if a mountain of old snow within him melted all at once. He pressed his lips to the child's brow, voice unsteady. "I never thought I would have a whole family again." From then on, the cabin's quiet took on another rhythm. A baby's cry cut the winter nights. Miriam sang slow, steady tunes. Elias, the old bear who had lived alone, learned to change swaddles and walk the floor till the little one slept. He wasn't good at it, but patience lived in his eyes, and the hands that had known only rifle and axe found a father's gentleness. He carried the child to the porch in the mornings, wrapped in the thickest blanket, to let her breathe the clean air. Sometimes Miriam stood beside him, head tucked to his shoulder. "Do you see?" she teased. "She looks for you more than me." Elias smiled, a true warming smile. "She knows who walks her out to meet the sun." By the time spring greened the corn rows, the baby laughed. Her bright giggle rang over the little field where Miriam spread a quilt for her to kick and wriggle, and Elias laughed too, as if new water had reached ground long gone dry. People in town changed with the seasons. They stopped staring and started stopping by, bringing a basket of bread, a woolen blanket, a word of blessing. The shopkeeper's wife murmured, "A baby makes many things easier to forgive." It proved true. The child's presence thinned the old bitter talk. With each season, the family knit closer. Elias added a small room on the back of the cabin so Miriam could sew and the child could play. He set posts for the wildflowers Miriam loved, purple and yellow waving in the wind outside the window. One summer evening, Miriam sat by the open frame, the baby asleep in her arms. Elias sat close with the old Bible. Miriam lifted her eyes and smiled. "Do you realize it? Your old vow has changed." Elias closed the book and sat quiet, then nodded. "The day I buried my wife, I swore my heart would never stir. Today I swear something else. Never to let you and our child stand alone." That's the real vow. Miriam took his hand, tears bright, and in that moment they both knew this roof was built with more than timber. It stood on trust and choice, on choosing to face weather together. The next year brought a son. Elias wept again when he held the boy, remembering how he once believed he would never hear a child's first cry. The cabin grew fuller, louder, and happier. When another winter came and the wind sang along the roofline, Elias stood on the porch with two little ones at his boots, and Miriam with the baby in her arms. He watched them and felt as if he stood inside a dream he had spent half his life refusing. Then he knew the dream was real. He had a family, a home, a love rekindled from the ashes of loneliness. He vowed, if the blizzards ever returned, he would not lose it. Some stories do not close with a gunshot or a hard end. They settle with a long breath, the soft snap of firewood, and the look of two people who finally found each other after years of weather. Elias, who thought his heart buried in Wyoming stone, found it beating again. Miriam, who thought she had only flight left, found a place to stand. From a single night of storm, they wove a life back together, with warmth, patience, and a tender, stubborn faith. This is not only a love story, it is a story of renewal, proof that even a hardened, aging heart can be warmed once more. If this tale brought a quiet smile or a sting of tears, leave a comment and share what it stirred in you. Don't forget to like and subscribe to follow more Wild West love stories, where love and faith find a way to root, even in the driest ground. Where are you listening from? Leave a hello so we can feel a little closer.